What you are watching is a Christina Aguilera performance at the 2000 MTV VMAs, something which originally may seem to be a quaint piece of nostalgia for the Y2K age. However, in typical VMA fashion, this will actually be a collaborative performance with another featured mystery artist. And so as the beat changes, a figure clad in a backwards hat emerges from the crowd to claim the crown for himself as pop royalty. That man is one Fred Durst. How in the name of all that is holy did the man who brags about skinning biblical donkeys get to be the ringer for one of pop's biggest stars after he was blamed for music's biggest disaster? This video I'm going to go over how Limp Bizkit came from nothing, rose to the top of the mountain, came all the way back down, and then actually came back up again, all through the misunderstood genius of Fred Durst. Seriously. Born Frederick Allen Maine III on August 20th, 1970, Fred would enter this world as the man of 1,000 faces, notably whenever he was immediately rechristened Fred Durst after his mother married a local police officer. Fred's family moved around a lot whenever he was younger, and he said that this led to him getting a lot of bullying because he was kind of a creative guy. Apparently that was not flying in the circles that he was in. But he said that this bullying also gave him his creative drive, as he said, "I believe my creative spirit is definitely vengeful." Once you're a victim of bullying, it sticks with you. And I think that you can see from the beginning that Fred Durst was not this ultimate bro type that he liked to portray himself as to the media. Because of his favorite music styles that he would have as a teenager, notably heavy metal, punk, and rap, these would go on later to become the Limp Bizkit sound as we would know it, but it was also a source of huge bullying for the young Durst. He would later go on to say, "There was a jock scene and a bad boy redneck scene and a black scene. I was part of all of them in a weird way, but until the Beastie Boys came out, I was called..." Okay, so he also said, I couldn't go to parties. I would get ganged by so many people. I learned to fight good. And all of the interviews talking about Fred's childhood, he really tries to push this front of like, I really just loved growing up in North Carolina. There was so much going on. But also, he's letting on that like there was a lot of breaking stuff, notably Freddie D's face. And in another bizarre turn, Fred would join the Navy for what he calls 18 soul-crushing months. Fred Durst is an all-American hero. Like, salute the flag. But after getting a medical discharge after a skateboarding injury in the Navy, he would actually end up moving back to Jacksonville. And to give you an idea of just how unimpressive things were at this point in time for Fred, I'm going to read this excerpt from the Limp Bizkit book, which I believe is the only published text ever on Limp Bizkit. So, the summer of 1990 was a bad time to be Fred Durst. Back home in Jacksonville, Florida, after a stint in the Navy, a failed marriage, and fathering a baby daughter, Durst had no prospects of his own, and there are few people who would have wanted to step into his shell-toed shoes job. Fred turned to his father Bill, a retired cop who had recently began a landscaping business for employment. So he's just like this divorced single dad working landscaping for his dad's, gardening company. So this is maybe where we're getting a little bit more of the like I got court in the morning vibes that Limp Bizkit like really employ. But it really makes you think of just like how unlikely it really was for Fred Durst to go on to do anything in show business. But Fred, so to say, had that dog in him, and he began to have dreams of superstardom, but not in music, but as Freddie Ford Coppola. So yeah, if you didn't know, Fred actually originally wanted to be a film director, and he started to think of this idea of what the perfect band for him to film would be. And this platonic idea of this perfect band is what would actually end up becoming Limp Bizkit. And you can almost imagine it with this like superhero origin story of he's creating like this ideal character to be the leader of this perfect band. But what he creates is like just the platonic ideal of the bro. Just the teeny bopper packaging of I have hep C. But this idea, however silly it may have been, actually really seemed to resonate with Fred, and so he began the process of actually creating that group. And so he began cannibalizing the best members of various local bands in the Jacksonville scene. And this shows without a doubt Fred Durst's single best ability that will show up again and again throughout his entire career. His ability to see what other people like. Fred Durst just understood on some elemental level what good music and successful music more particularly sounded like. And those musicians he knew could help him accomplish that goal. Like, I really do think that if Fred Durst could have just like outsourced the writing, if he could have just had some ghostwriters write the raps up for him, I really do think that Limp Bizkit could have been literally one of the best bands of all time. They're already excellent as they are, but I do think that Fred Durst would, unquestionably not fight me on that. He thinks that he is probably the weakest link musically speaking in his group, but he had the self-awareness, I suppose, to surround himself with as many good musicians as humanly possible. And he did that in this original incarnation. He scalped John Otto, who was an experimental jazz drummer in the local Jacksonville scene. And in probably his best single acquisition, he got Wes Borland, who's unironically one of the most technically skilled guitarists that I've ever seen. There's a lot of things that he's playing on these records that you think he's doing with pedals or some stuff, but he's actually just playing that on his guitar. And once he had gathered these absolute top tier musicians, he set about creating what was the most disgusting band name he could possibly think of. Limp Bizkit became Limp Bizkit because they were purposely trying to create a name that was so disgusting that it would weed out anybody who wasn't just going to be ride or die for this band. And they went through some truly scatological names to do that, and you can look up the list if you want to. But they eventually settled on the name Limp Bizkit, obviously, which is already a very kind of just disgusting name. But whenever you know that it unintentionally refers to a game which is like not safe for life, then it really, boy, the gears were just really grinding in that session. Just unintentionally arriving at like the most disgusting thing possible. And Limp Bizkit began garnering a cult following in this local Jacksonville scene by just really pounding the pavement and putting on these shows in these local clubs. They apparently became so famous in this local scene that they had Sugar Ray open up for them at one point. Now granted, this wasn't I Wanna Fly Sugar Ray, this is while they were still trying to be a new metal band, but the fact remains that they had a record label, Limp Bizkit didn't, and they were the ones opening up for them in Jacksonville. And the reason why the Limp Bizkit crowd sizes went from being in the single digits to the hundreds within a couple of months is because Fred Durst was continuously marketing the band. He was always going in the record stores to get their CDs on the shelves, and he was in contact with like local high school groups just to get the word out. And it also makes complete sense because a lot of the famous Limp Bizkit stuff that they would be doing at their peak, they were already doing as a local band. Wes Borland was already dressing up in this crazy body paint and doing these outfits. And he also began the habit of playing these very heavy versions of these like real corny 80s pop songs. Playing a cover as a local band, trying to make it in the music business, takes a lot of humility because whenever you're at a show, you want to be playing your music. And for them to have the wherewithal to know, no, this is actually just kind of fun for us to do, really takes a lot of like upper level thinking. And it's because Limp Bizkit was willing to have fun with these crazy covers that they would garner these huge audiences because people knew that they were going to be getting a show even if you didn't like really the band themselves. However, Jacksonville could not contain Freddie D, and he knew that they needed to be up on the national level. And so whenever Korn came to town, he met up with the group and offered to give them free tattoos. But, he's not that good, remember? So he tried to do Korn, but like he wrote horn. But because it's Korn, they're like, I guess that's good enough. You want to open up for us on tour? And once again, showing Fred's just true like expert level business ability, he was able to open up on 2 nationwide tours. And he was also able to bring in DJ Lethal, who was hot off the presses from a #1 song with his previous group House of Pain, into the Limp Bizkit fold. And because of this absolute insane exposure that Fred had been able to engineer for this once again unsigned band, there were some record labels that had began courting the group. And because of that, the boys were in contact with a lot of different labels at this point. At first they thought that they were going to sign with Flip Records, however then they got a very lucrative deal from Mojo Records. And in one of the absolute most surreal moments I have ever read about in any context, the owner of Flip Records said this: "The band told me, and this is a direct quote, the only way that we're not going to sign with Mojo is if our band flips over on the way to LA. The van flipped over on its way to LA. It actually flipped 5 times. While people were injured, no one died, which is an absolutely insane thing for how big of an accident it was. And you can really tell that they took this as a sign from God that they needed to get their act together. This is like Saul on his way to Damascus being blinded by God. This is a true, Apostle Fred is rising up from the ashes here. And because of this, just Deus Ex Machina moment, Fred called Wes because they had been having a tiff, and he's like, I'm not going to be in the band anymore. And he got him to come back. And it's something that comes up again and again, is that Wes kind of thought that he was a little bit too good for Limp Bizkit, and Fred also at times thought that he was a little bit too good for Limp Bizkit. But they knew that together, while they did get on each other's nerves, they just worked so much better. And so with Wes in tow, the group would end up signing with Flip Records, as co-signed by God himself, apparently. They would record the album $3 Bill Y'all, which would feature their first breakout single, a cover from one of their early days of George Michael's Faith. The Faith cover is such an interesting song because it is just Limp Bizkit, absolutely slaughtering the tune. You can't listen to this in mixed company, but God, do I love it. But it would take a minute for the Faith single to really kind of have its moment in the sun. And $3 Bill Y'all would be released on July 1st, 1997 to rapturous indifference. Yeah, it basically had no results on the charts for months. This is an extremely common occurrence for bands. Even of those who do get signed, it's very unlikely that you will ever make some kind of meaningful difference in the music business. It's just kind of hard. Not even Fred Durst performing nude would have got them any coverage, which they did. Thankfully, no photos of that have ever surfaced, but don't worry, we'll get around to that a little bit later. In fact, it was no actual performance that would actually get them their first headline. It was in fact something that would set the tone for the rest of the media coverage that they would ever receive as a group, which is to say, very negative coverage. In 1998, Limp Bizkit, through Interscope, paid $5,000 to guarantee that a radio station in Portland, Oregon would play the song Counterfeit 50 times, preceded and concluded with an announcement that the airtime was paid for by Interscope. This payola controversy shows both elements of the Limp Bizkit image, where on one hand, they are in fact paying money to force radio stations to play their music, which can seem a bit scummy, but also as media manipulation geniuses. As while yes, they did pay that money to play that song 50 times on one radio station in Portland, Oregon, the headlines for this would go international. And it was this negative press which would give this fledgling band the airtime that they so desperately craved. Even though it did set them off on a bad foot with the media, something which of course would continue with them throughout the rest of their career. However, partially bolstered by these headlines, the group was able to move up through the circuits and keep getting on better and better tours. And with the headlines and the Faith song both out into the ether, another event would also help make the group a household name. That event being George Michael being arrested for indecent exposure in a bathroom.
And then wham! He was busted.
It was just a very scandalous time to be alive, and George Michael was getting his fair share of ribbing right now, and this kind of sacrilegious cover of his song just really fit into the overall conversation zeitgeist that was going on at the time. George Michael, for his part, said that he hated the cover and hated Limp Bizkit for doing it. But Limp Bizkit was able to parlay this news coverage into eventually finally making it onto Korn's Family Values tours, where they would shoot the music video for Faith. Finally, after all of these setbacks, Limp Bizkit would have the vehicle which would immediately start to push them towards superstardom. Something that they immediately capitalized on June 22nd, 1999, when they released the album Significant Other. Because while yes, they did have a successful song, once again, it was a cover. And there's a lot of ways that Limp Bizkit could have just become the next Alien Ant Farm, or just what they were perceived as the time as just sort of this Korn cover band. But the Fred boys were really just dialed in to making sure that that Limp Bizkit got across the line. And they did that with a little song called Nookie. Nookie is kind of just the synthesis of what makes Limp Bizkit great. It's Fred posturing like he's the ultimate bro, but whenever you listen to the lyrics, he's just this complete chud. Like, he's just a complete loser, which is reflective of Fred Durst's life. He's both trying to be the ultimate bro, but also fully aware that he is nowhere in any shape, form actually able to be that guy. And because of this duality, he's able to appeal to 100% of the male population. Guys who think that they're the guy, and guys who wish that they were the guy. This is why this album hit #1. It's just simple human psychology, fellas. And from this point, with the songs off Significant Other, including Break Stuff, this would push the group up to what was definitely the top of the nu metal pile. And Fred was multiplying the success with several performances on MTV and also just showing up as a personality to commentate. And it's in this environment, as kind of the hot new kid on the block, that they would experience what was supposed to be their biggest success up to this point. Woodstock 99. So this could honestly be its own video, and honestly one day it may be. By the time that Limp Bizkit arrived to give their performance, Woodstock 99 was already falling apart. The thing had been incredibly poorly planned, there wasn't great facilities, and the crowd was in a very raw mood. So whenever Limp Bizkit comes and says break stuff, yeah, they started breaking stuff. It's not that surprising to think, how did this happen? And while the public narrative around this has been kind of course corrected as time has went on, at the time, Limp Bizkit was 100% seen by the public as being directly responsible for this riot. If you were like a casual music fan or just kind of generally uninformed about the group, you would think that Fred Durst had literal blood on his hands from this event. Which is why it's so sad whenever you see him saying stuff like, I didn't see anybody getting hurt. When you're looking out on a sea of people and the stage is 20 feet in the air and you're performing and you're feeling your music, how do you expect us to see something bad going on? And I mean, yeah, it's literally a sea of humans. There's no way that you would see anything going on other than like, oh wow, I'm really playing here. And I feel like that a lot of popular narratives would like to say that this is the beginning of the end for Limp Bizkit. But that's really just not the case. I know that that would make sense from like our 3-point story arc structure, but the truth of the matter is that Limp Bizkit was very much still on the ascent. Significant Other stayed at #1 in the charts, and they would go on to play their Family Values tour later that year. In fact, their biggest chart success ever would happen in the year 2000 when they would release the Chocolate Starfish and Hot Dog Flavored Water, which would go essentially #1 worldwide and would in fact have the highest first week sales for a rock album, with over 1 million copies sold in the US on its first week of release. 400,000 of those would happen in the first day. Fred truly in the company of Taylor Swift and Adele. It's just the sisterhood of equals up there with those numbers. And that is because at this point, Limp Bizkit was essentially as popular as heavy music ever got to the broad public. Roland even had like its own dance that it was trying to do, like the Macarena. So I mean, he really was in the same conversation as Britney Spears, who he allegedly may or may not have been dating at some point. But the fact that like that was even a feasible thing for people to imagine shows what league of like popularity that he had truly achieved. Allegedly, Cry Me a River is about Justin Timberlake and his feels cause Fred Durst got that nookie. Good lord. But it is one of those things of it's like when everything was working at full crank and all the Limp Bizkit juices had been mixed in the exact right proportion, they were really just this triangulation of popular music, of rap, heavy metal, and pop, where they just kind of hit the broadest swath of the demographic pool. And at this point, Limp Bizkit was literally inescapable. They were at WWE, they were at swimsuit contests. You couldn't even play video games without being beaten by Fred Durst. And this isn't even going into the 40,000 feuds that he had with everybody from like Creed to Eminem. He was big. He was big, okay? The Class of 99 TRL photo shoot is just this surreal moment. I mean, this really is just like the high water mark for human experience right here. And all of this is happening, meanwhile, while Fred Durst is the senior vice president of Interscope Records. This is insane. I literally can't think of like another person who was that successful both as a musician, but also from the music business standpoint, besides Diddy, who we're not going to talk about right now.
Editing lab.
And this wasn't like a do-nothing position. Like Durst scouted several successful bands like Puddle of Mud, Cold, Stained, and She Wants Revenge. Once again, this is a guy who just a few years earlier was throwing lawn trimmings in the back of a truck in the Florida heat. And now he's on stage having a feud with Scott Stapp. Once again, high water mark for our civilization.
You walk by his dressing room, his people, they look at you and they go, "You do not approach the band, you do not talk to the band, you do not look at the band." and you're just like, what is the deal with this guy, man?
And he did this with the most unattractive band name imaginable, performing the most unmarketable music possible, and solely through his business expertise was able to guide this group to the top of the mountain. However, the thing is, there's only one place to go once you're at the top of the mountain. It's not the good direction. And the descent would really begin in 2001, where after a performance at the Big Day Out Festival in Sydney, Australia, a teenager would die from asphyxiation. Another situation where Limp Bizkit would essentially be blamed for the poor mismanagement of the festival. Fred said that he told the organizers that he thought that the place was dangerous. However, they were like, if you don't go up and play, we're going to arrest you. And then he does, and then this happens. So then in October of that year, Fred released a statement saying that him and Wes Borland had split ways. And then also kind of humorously at this point, they tried to get another guitarist, allegedly with this group of guitar tryouts at all these guitar centers, and it was an absolute disaster. It was really just getting to the point where it was like PR disaster after PR disaster, but they eventually replaced Wes with snot guitarist Mike Smith. And it was in this compromised state that they would release their next album, Results May Vary, and the results did vary, am I right? So once again, the last album was one of the quickest selling albums of all time, a record that still stands to this day, and would go on to sell 8 million copies. This album has sold about 1/8 of that. And once again, Limp Bizkit was in a situation where their biggest song was a cover. The songs on this album were just simply not as good as the other records, and it really does show just how much Wes brought to the group, and without him, the absence is felt. Now, broader culture had always been a little bit uncomfortable with Limp Bizkit, which is not that surprising. They literally created themselves to be the most hateable group in existence. And it's only because of Fred's masterful skill at manipulating the environment that he was able to consistently punch above weight. And the moment that they weren't on their A games, the Haterade chickens had come home to roost, and brother, they were packing something, because the public dog pile had started. This review of Results May Vary from The Guardian and may sum up the public opinion best. Does anyone still care? You can see this at this performance in 2003, where reporting says, from the beginning of the show, there were people in the crowd with Fred Sucks banners, and every time one of the other bands mentioned Limp Bizkit, the audience booed. And whenever Limp Bizkit would come on stage, the crowd would start throwing garbage at them, but Fred was like, this is why your baseball teams suck. None of you can hit me with your garbage. Wes Borland would rejoin the group in 2004, and they would release this EP. However, it would sell about 100,000 copies, which is an even steeper step down from their already disappointing last album. This disaster of sales was due in no small part due to the fact that Fred did no promotion for the album, and there was some talk that he may have wanted to self-sabotage this effort, as he was really just growing tired with the Limp Bizkit project. So this is whenever you start getting the reviews saying that Fred Durst is the most single, unimpressive, absurd frontman in rock, and this is also whenever he had a sex tape leak, which was the add insult to injury called unimpressive. Limp Bizkit indeed. Am I right, kids? And it's at this point that Fred and the other Bizkit boys just kind of checked out of the music scene and went on this indefinite hiatus for years. Fred, during these years, did get to explore his first love, notably filmmaking, but he spent most of this time just kind of laying low. And after the group reunited back in 2009, they would release another album called Gold Cobra, which would also not do very well. And they also signed to Cash Money Records, which is just absolutely bizarre. But they say that it's always darkest before dawn. And it was at this point in time that the 20-year nostalgia cycle came for its most unlikely benefactor, Limp Bizkit. The current landscape of the desolate, war-torn, post-pandemic world, the early aughts started to seem like this lost golden age. And even Limp Bizkit, who at the time seemed to be the worst impulses of man, dredged up to the surface. Even Limp Bizkit started to seem like something that could be remembered fondly. And this groundswell was confirmed in 2021 whenever the group released Limp Bizkit Still Sucks. And I think that it's in this current environment where Limp Bizkit is fully aware of like who they are, what they represent, and what space they hold in the market, that it shows that even them at their most dangerous was a walk in the park with the Care Bears compared to what we deal with every other Tuesday now. And this is why you're seeing such love, both from the people who were around at the time, but also those generations like myself who don't ever remember Limp Bizkit at their peak and only know them from their hate. Because after the sands of time polish away all the edges, you really realize they actually did have quite a few golden moments. And while Limp Bizkit is not perfect, and I do want to say, while researching this, I did come across several incidents that were just like, yeah, no, actually Limp Bizkit deserved a flag from this. I do have to say that the world is a better place with Freddie D in it. Because whenever Limp Bizkit was able to put the pieces together, they were able to create genuinely great music. And all of us are in some small way indebted to Fred Durst and this immaculate knowledge that he was able to utilize to gain his way to the top of the mountain. It is truly an inspirational tale for all of us who have had Court in the Morning.